I thought I'd give a bit of coverage today because they are the kind of stuff that need to be on DBQs and on essays. And so you should be familiar with not only these foreign folks, but keep in mind that the economy of the colonies was in shambles. They didn't have an economy really to speak of. Keep in mind who had been their biggest trade partner was British, and now they're at war with the British, so they don't have much trade. Their money's not worth anything. So what I want to talk about, though, is the role of African Americans, because this is often overlooked. And they did make up a portion, a sizable portion in some cases, of folks who were fighting. And so you should come away from this slide, particularly being familiar with what's known as, in some quarters, as Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. Okay. Now, Governor Dunmore was the governor of Virginia. You may remember him. He's the one who dismissed the House of Burgesses and later would try to get Patrick Henry and Jefferson and others arrested. But Dunmore, who, keep in mind, the British had slavery. Obviously, they wouldn't let the colonies outlaw it. But he made a decision here in Virginia that there were a group of people who were probably useful for putting down the revolution, and they were African Americans. They were black people. Because blacks really would not have had a vested reason, Dunmore believed, to stay loyal to slave owners, to plantation owners. And many of the leaders of the Virginia revolutionary attitude were slave owners. And so he inaugurated the induction of African Americans into the British Army. And so slaves became free. If they came to Dunmore, to the Virginia official government, British government, then they would be incorporated into the British Army. And so as many as 12,000 former slaves joined the British Army. They ran away and they became slaves, ex-slave soldiers, and they got their freedom. If they did this, the British would not have them be slaves anymore. That led the Continental Congress, on the urging of this man, Alexander Hamilton. And I think it's appropriate that Hamilton, much of the cast is portrayed by African Americans in the musical, because Hamilton urged the Continental Congress to bring African Americans into the Army. Because if we don't do it, I'll let you read his writing in a minute. But what you began to see then were both slaves and free blacks, particularly free blacks, in the colonial army, in the Continental Army. So blacks would now be able to serve to some degree. I don't want to exaggerate the role. It wasn't huge, but it was present. It was real. So this is what Hamilton says. I have no doubt Negroes, the traditional word for African American or people of African descent, will make very excellent soldiers with proper management. The same could be true of any of American militia with proper management. I foresee this project will have to combat prejudice and selfishness, self-interest. And that's very important because Hamilton right away is saying racism is going to prevent this from happening, as well as people not wanting their slaves to be free. The contempt we have been taught, I love that, we have been taught to be racist, to entertain for the blacks, makes us fancy many things that are not found in reason nor experience. In other words, our racism that we've been taught is both unreasonable and not based on reality. And an unwillingness to part with property will be the 1,000 arguments. Okay. So in other words, it's not because these folks can't be good soldiers. It's because people don't want to lose their property. Okay. Of course, they'll have to sacrifice that, he says, but it should be considered. If we do not use Negroes this way, the enemy probably will. And they did. An essential part of the plan is to give them their freedom with their muskets. So Hamilton's going to argue if we don't arm and utilize our, as he called them, Negroes, then of course the British will. And so that does happen. Now, again, I don't want to oversell that too much to the point of 12,000 is a sizable percentage of people on both sides. Okay. But who plays perhaps a much greater role are women, overall women in the war effort. And first of all, I want to mention where you would most have encountered women during the war directly, meaning most women, by the way, would have been at home manning both the plantation or the farm or the house and the family. But those who didn't would become camp followers. And for example, Martha Washington for a period of time was a camp follower to its extent, meaning, officers would have their wives and families sometimes follow the army. So you had to be married to a soldier, and the army would feed you half of the rations for men. So in other words, This actually would be paid for by taxpayer money and not the Army directly. But the theory is that to help your children and your wife, keep in mind, under the system of colonial economy, husbands were the breadwinners, right? Literally at times. And so the soldiers would then pay the women who would do this kind of these tasks, like traditional women's work at the time, like sewing their uniforms and cooking their meals and stuff like this. But the Army didn't pay them. So they got rations from the Army, more or less, out of the amount of troops rations. But their pay came from, the services they rendered. So you would find normally when I'm talking to you about battles like Battle of Guilford Courthouse or, the battles of not necessarily Saratoga, but some of the battles near Long Island, there would be lots of women around the major camp. That's not the only role women played, though. Another role, it's again not enormous in terms of the grand scheme, but still present, where women actually served in the Army unofficially. Keep in mind, women were not allowed to enlist in the Army. But you had, for example, perhaps you've heard of Molly Pitcher. I'm not sure. So, fighting would be very hot. And this battle at Monmouth was a hot day, and women camp followers, this group up here, would frequently bring water to the soldiers and to the wounded. And so you would hear, and Molly is an affectionate name for Mary. So the name Molly is one of the most common names at that time in colonial America. So in other words, lots of women were named Mary, and so they were usually called Molly. I don't know why that happened, but that's what happened. And so so you would hear them say, Molly, a pitcher of water, Molly, pitcher of water. And they would also even pour that over the guns to cool off the cannons. So what happened is, we think, people who research this stuff think, is that the name Molly and pitcher of water became Molly Pitcher. It was a composite, not a real person, but a folk hero of actual women who served in battle when their husbands were shot. So Mary Hayes, this woman right here, when her husband was wounded, she took up the ramrod on the cannon and then started putting the cannon gunpowder in the cannon herself. So in other words, she helped fight as artillery. This woman, Deborah Sampson, actually served in the Army pretending to be a man. So she wanted so much to fight that she became Robert Shurtleff and enlisted in the I think it was Massachusetts soldiers. So women would actually serve, although rarely. This is where I think women had the most strategic significance on the war. Strategic, and there's a television series on, I think it's like Amazon or something, but it's about Washington Spy Network, the Culper Ring. It's called Culper Ring right here, which was a group of spies that would literally watch the British activity in New York City. The British took over New York City completely. So these people, particularly this ring right here, would follow what was going on in New York and get word of it out to George Washington. Now, one of these ladies is near Valley Forge, Lydia Darragh, and she warned when the British were getting ready to attack. This lady is really fascinating to me because she actually was a sculptress. She sculpted British officers of the government, Patience Wright. And so she would, say she was sculpting an officer's bust, the head kind of thing. She would actually put inside of it secret codes that were what she overheard, and send that here to America, and General Washington would get it. And then you also had Anna Strong, who would hang out her laundry in a particular way to signal what the British movement was going to be. So American revolutionaries could spot how her laundry was hanging, and it would be a signal. So women frequently were spies. Okay, they were definitely camp followers, which you should be familiar of or with. But the other major role that women had was to actually physically defend their home communities. So here you have, Prudence Wright's Guard or Mrs. Wright's Guard, and this is a all-female militia in Massachusetts that defended the Nashua River. They actually shot at loyalists who were trying to cross the river. So these women were actually, like, for lack of a better word, militia soldiers. And because the men were all fighting, like say if you're a Virginian and you're stationed in Pennsylvania, you're not defending your home community. All right. So these women would have that role, Prudence Wright's Guard or Mrs. David Wright's Guard. Okay. So that's another role. And then yet another way women were very influential in the war effort is they made uniforms for soldiers. Keep in mind, there were no uniforms in America. And most famously is what became nicknamed affectionately as Washington Sewing Circle. This lady authored something called the Sentiments of the American Woman. She was a patriotic figure. She created a group, or she was a member of a group called the Ladies Association. And she says, I glory in which all my sex has done. I call to mind with enthusiasm and admiration the acts of courage and patriotism which history has given to us. And today, groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution, I think, carry on this sort of tradition, this legacy of patriotism, particularly amongst women. She raised hundreds of thousands of dollars amongst her neighbors in Philadelphia, rich city, Philadelphia. And they had lots of uniform clothing made. Now, perhaps the most famous woman of the Revolutionary period is not even real. I mean, not real in a sense that what she did isn't what she did. Betsy Ross is very famous. Many people, credit Betsy Ross with creating the American flag. Unfortunately, that's not true. That's inaccurate. What happened is her grandson, a fellow by the name of William Canby, wanted to make his grandma famous. And so he gives her credit for something that Congress had already done. All right. And so the point is that she may have made a flag for George Washington, but she certainly didn't make the flag. And so sometimes it helps Americans to have a singular person to give credit to. Like, isn't this so much nicer than trying to keep up with all these different groups? We'll just make one person the symbol, Betsy Ross. But that's not really fair to so many other women who were very much active participants, particularly when it's not historically accurate. So I don't know why we teach Betsy Ross. Well, it's kind of like Plymouth Rock. The Puritans never landed at Plymouth Rock, or the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was not fought on Bunker Hill. So there's lots of this stuff that actually isn't accurate. Okay, so why am I talking about all this? Well, first of all, because I think it's important that it not be left out. But secondly, this has been an AP question. So I wanted you to see this. The revolutionary moment was neither radical nor a watershed for women. Those who disregard America's commitment to patriarchal rule, that's men in charge, plead for a historical interpretation that favors enlightened exceptionalism, have overlooked the conditions that made it impossible at that time for women. So this is a woman historian, author of women's history, saying revolution didn't do anything for women, really. All right. But this other female historian, who's an author of women's history as well, says the coming of the revolution created new opportunities to participate in politics. Responding to men's appeal, women engaged in a variety of actions to support the revolution, which led women to experience greater connection to the polity, the act of politics. After the war, their contributions were praised and remembered. Women were now political beings, not just spouses. So two historians, both of which works were published, two different perspectives on the role of women during the revolution. Now, that's important because whenever you have a historical debate, you get one of these FRQs, right? And so this is the kind of stuff that, I want you to see that it's not simply one answer. It's a debate about, did women change dramatically as a result of the revolution or not? And I know many teachers seek to give the definitive answer, like this is the answer. But that's not how it works. Some of what Crane says is very true. But some of what Zakari says is also very true. So if you choose one side or the other, you're basically ignoring the other side. And what you have to do is recognize that there were changes, but it was not enough to override the gender roles in America. Women did become somewhat involved in politics, but I would argue not enough for them to shape the future for very long. Okay, so that's the kind of stuff. And here's how, when I'm grading your FRQs, this is how I want you to make sure you understand. Women's status didn't change, Crane says. Gender roles remain unchanged. Okay, and then you have Zakari says, women's status and social influence improved. Well, that's a change, isn't it? And women were now able to participate. So, debating on degree is often where we see people having confusion. People describe, modern Democrats as liberals, and maybe that's true for some modern Democrats, but many, like if you take Joe Biden, he's very, very much a moderate, and that's why many liberals aren't happy with him. So what happens is perspective matters. If you ask a conservative, is Joe Biden liberal? They'll say yes. You ask a liberal, if Joe Biden's liberal, they'll say no. So it's like, well, who's right? It depends on the context, on who's answering. So things to take away, and this is in your PowerPoint that's uploaded, but I'll let you look at this. Women could not vote as a result of the revolution, except for New Jersey. New Jersey made a mistake, if you want to call it this. They allowed the people to vote who own property. Well, guess who could own property in New Jersey? Women. So New Jersey's simple voting rules were all you had to do was be a property owner. Well, they changed that. They fixed that mistake. And so they said male property owner later. But initially, only New Jersey. So we're going to say women couldn't vote as a result of the revolution. Women did not get the rights guaranteed in the Declaration. If they had, you probably wouldn't have ever heard of Susan B. Anthony. Because, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is going to read out loud at the Seneca Falls Convention the Declaration of Independence, except she's going to insert the word woman instead of man. And basically she's going to say, we didn't get the self-evident truths. Women did not make up the political decision makers after the war. Perhaps your most famous quote from the period is what Abigail Adams, I would like you to know this quote and who gave it. Abigail Adams, sending John Adams off to Continental Congress, said, be sure to remember the ladies when you're making your new code of laws. The new code of laws should include rights for women. They did not. Okay. We're going to talk more about this ideal of the Republican motherhood later. That's lowercase r, not the political party, but the ideal of republicanism. And I'll talk more about that. But tragically, married women did not have legal rights. So, for example, women could not initiate divorce in America. Women could not have custody of their children if a separation or divorce occurred. When a woman got married, her property became that of her husband, certainly in New England. And so gender roles, I think, do not change dramatically. Now, there were some changes during the war, particularly the idea that women had a key role in the economic sphere. So I think rather than just focus solely on the private sphere, which was true, women were the consumers of America. Women were the folks that purchased the goods. And maybe the most important contribution women had were in the non-importation agreements, if you remember those things, and the boycotts, because the women were the ones who made those decisions. And I imagine even at your home, who does the grocery shopping and frequently makes the decisions for your clothes and things like that, still a traditional female gender role, at least your clothes when you were a kid. So this is examples of what I would most be familiar with. They participated in the protest. That's, to me, the most significant that women actually did. Yes, women were, fundraisers and at times fought in combat, rarely. Yes, some women advised presidents, Mercy Warren, for example, of course, Abigail Adams. But by and large, the biggest role women had in the war effort